So the next speaker is going to be Jason Silverman. Wait, open this. Who comes originally from the, if I understand correctly, from Trinity College Dublin. Sorry? Comes from Trinity College London. He is currently at the University of Helsinki as a postdoctoral fellow. Is that true?
University researcher.
Sorry?
University researcher.
Okay, university researcher. And does a lot of things in Persian times. So he's in the right place. He deals with the impact of the Persian Empire on Judean communities, that is the inhabitants of Judah and modern southern Israel, Palestine. And he's the author of the monograph Persepolis and Jerusalem on Iranian influence on Judaism from 2012. And he has edited and co-edited 4 volumes related to Persian period Judaism. So please, Jason is going to talk about, again, small letters, Yahwism in the religion field of the Achaemenid Empire, using Bourdieu as a theorist of religious change in the Persian Empire. Please.
Get rid of this. Great. Okay. Well, I have to say thank you to Carl for starting this off easy, because I'm going into not easy. If anyone's familiar with Bourdieu, he is notoriously complicated. So buckle your seatbelts. It's a very great honor for me to be at the symposium today in the memory of Shaul Shaked, a man who pioneered the study of Irana Judaica and a man whose assessments of Iranian influence are still some of the most lucid on offer. I only had the privilege of meeting him a handful of times at ASPS meetings, where he was very gracious and supportive. I hope he would have found this paper of interest. So everyone in the audience is well aware of the difficulties inherent in attempting to understand or define religion. These problems are compounded when we try to understand how different or how similar ancient religion was from that in our contemporary society. They get even more abstruse when one tries to understand how to fit it into the wider social structure, not to mention understanding that wider social structure. Should religion be treated as an independent phenomenon in human society, subsumed under the wider culture, or dismissed as merely the verbal superstructure of the political economy? Some of these difficulties, of course, derive from the limited extant evidentiary basis. Some, however, come from the tools with which we think about these things. Perhaps they have been too blunt or too influenced by the 19th and 20th centuries to reveal more than they obscure. I do not have the space to rehearse the history of these debates in the field. Rather, I will briefly describe some tools from Pierre Bourdieu's field theory that I think have the potential of placing old debates in new, perhaps more productive light. Bourdieu's own foray into ancient Near Eastern religion was very much dependent on Weber's earlier work, and thus has little to commend it in itself. Nonetheless, his theoretical concepts and orientation remain highly flexible and insightful, inviting new, more relational assessment of religion in the Persian Empire and the wider ancient Near East. Great. So Bourdieu's in field theory. Bourdieu is widely utilized in sociology, anthropology, and more recent history, though he has received rather little engagement from Near Eastern historians. Those who have appealed to him have most often appealed to his famous concept of habitus. The wider breadth and analytical capability of his theory, however, remains underexplored. I find one of the most compelling aspects of his thought is his effort to resist reductionism while retaining a relatively parsimonious toolkit. For Bourdieu, human society cannot be reduced to a mere epiphenomenon of economics. Neither is it simply a figment of the human imagination, with no reality outside of human perception. Humans are neither entirely free to do as they will, nor predetermined to do anything. Despite the fact that many of his own analyses are clearly indebted to the specific historical experience of France, Bourdieu himself was quite insistent that every historical case had to be reanalyzed anew, without assuming similarities to other times and locations. The concept for which his theory is often named, the field, Bourdieu has described as a network or a configuration of objective relations between positions that impose upon their occupants, agents, or institutions by their present and potential situation in the structure of the distribution of capital, access to the specific profits that are at stake in the field, which is on the screen. For Bourdieu, a field comprises individuals and institutions with varying degrees of actual and potential access to relevant capital, and we will return to capital below. And it is the relationships between these occupants that define the structure of the field. These relationships have both an objective reality, as in some positions have more capital than others, as well as subjective reality, the perception of each person within the field of their own position within that field. These interactions between these entities are determined by a shared investment in the field, what Bourdieu calls illugio or doxa, a shared understanding of the rules of the game, and an organized capital specific to that field. Each individual and institution in the field will, according to their habitus, attempt to increase, maintain, or even decrease their position in the field based on their subjective understanding of their position in that field. Thus, the topography of any given field is constantly changing as a result of these interactions. And Bourdieu prefers the word struggles from his Marxist background. Moreover, the very boundaries of a given field are part of the competition that takes place within the field. Contesting who and what are part of the field are part of the field. Nonetheless, no matter how fierce the competition between players, they share an unspoken, unconscious commitment to the values at stake in that field, or illusio. The field is a segment of society that is autonomous. What Bourdieu means by this is, and I quote, "As I use the term, a field is a separate social universe having its own laws of functioning, independent of those of politics and in the economy," unquote. By positing a field, therefore, one wishes to describe a segment of society in which the pursuit of specific capitals produces relations of positions independent of those in other fields, and with an internal logic or rules of the game that cannot be reduced to those structuring other parts of society. Older studies spoke of four canonical Bourdieusian fields: the economic, cultural, social, and political, though more recent field studies have utilized the term spheres for the universal fields of economics, culture, and politics. A key element to analyzing a field is determining the capitals at stake. Although borrowed from Marxist economics, within field theory, the point of capitals is to avoid a reduction to economic capital. As Bourdieu defines it, a species of capital is what is efficacious in a given field, both as a weapon and as a stake of struggle, that which allows its possessors to wield a power or an influence, and thus to exist in the field under consideration. This capital may or may not be useful in other fields, but it provides the main structuring principle for a given field. The concepts of political capital and social capital have been widely used in academia, even outside of a Bourdieusian context, implying at least their heuristic usability. A key aspect for field theory in this is that the capital provides both a shared orientation for those in the field, as well as providing the basis of power for those in higher positions in that field. Further, capitals can be exchanged or converted into other types of capital according to the logic of the society. This is also one mechanism for thinking about the relationships between fields in a given society. Okay. In their experience of and attempts to increase their position and access to capital in a given field, individuals and groups develop a habitus. And I will not read out his admittedly abstruse formulation, but it is here. In more prosaic language than this, Habit describes the ways of life and expectations for it that are unconsciously internalized by the individual or a group in relation to a particular field. This includes the person's subjective perception of their position in the field and their ability to impact their position. It also includes what Bourdieu calls hexis, the way in which one embodies one's habitus, so clothing, postures, gestures, etc. Recently, Haras has pointed to the example of musical and sports trainings for the way specific fields can inculcate very specific embodied practices. In the latter, Haras points to the possibility for individuals to have multiple habitus related to the various fields in which they inhabit. And Atkinson has called any individual's combination of habitus their social surface. So it's worth noting that one can speak of the habitus of a group or a class as well as of an individual. There are many more elements to field theory, but this brief overview of the three central concepts should suffice for setting the stage for this paper's proposal, to see the analytical purchase of thinking about a religious field in the Persian Empire. So as noted above, adequately conceptualizing ancient religion is not straightforward. This paper is a thought experiment to see what might be gained from thinking about religion in the Persian Empire as an autonomous field in the Bourdieusian sense. I want to emphasize that autonomous does not mean with no relations or interactions with other fields, but it operates with its own structuring capital and rules for the game with a logic outside mere politics or economics. That's not influenced by, but independent from. A key element to note in this regard is that the Persian king, like the Neo-Babylonian kings before him, was not a priest. Indeed, Darius's depiction of Gaumata as a magus implies a societal distinction between kingship and priesthood, and thus arguably between political and religious fields. It is the goal of this paper, therefore, to attempt to sketch what such a hypothesis would mean for understanding the period. A subsequent task, then, is to think about how such a field would have interacted with the political and economic fields or spheres. I think we are safe in calling the existence of the divine world and the divine origin of society a doxa in the Persian Empire, as it was in the ancient Near East generally. It was also a matter of some import to determine divine approval for all kinds of decisions, typically via divination, and in certain contexts, which divine entity was responsible. So, for example, it's common for magicians to name specific deities, just as the Avestan text insists on naming the deity being addressed. It was incumbent on a ruler to ensure that they were perceived as maintaining the divinely ordained order, even while there clearly was never any singularly agreed definition of what that divine order ought to be. While the logic of a religious field would operate apart from politics, its structures are likely to be homologous to those of the political field. Therefore, a key element in sketching the structure of the religious field at any given moment in time would be the great king's own religious practice. We will return to analyzing the relevance of the king in the religious field below. Other key elements to religion throughout the ancient Near East are, of course, the various types of priesthoods and sacred sites, most prominently temples. The kinds of priests and their remits are crucial to assessing the types of positions available within the field. This requires assessing not only the relative hierarchies of specific sites and specific types of priests, but also determining the interactions between priesthoods and between cults. Temple institutions are vital actors as well, with the relative prestige and power of temples no doubt strong elements in the relationship between priesthoods and potentially even between the laity. Further, one must not forget the hazier aspects of everyday religion, which were also a major part of the field. Anyone who revered the gods was part of the religious field, even if the lowest levels are likely to often fall outside our extant evidence. Since culturally posited supernatural entities, which is a phrase I like, were believed to exist, they also ought to be reckoned as comprising the topography of the field. Their relative prestige and purported competences would have major ramifications for actors' perceptions of their own positions in the field. A wide swath of practices, of course, belongs to this field. These include not just the sacrificial cults, but divination, calendars, festivals, funerary and mortuary traditions, etc. That not all practices held sway in all parts of the Near East is entirely in keeping with the Bourdieusian approach, whereby habitus is shaped by one's relative position in the field or social space. So, A field is structured around the distribution of a distinctive capital, so treating religion as a field at a given place and point in time requires one to identify what distinctly religious capital would comprise. As a note, it is worth remembering in this regard that multiple capitals may be of worth in a particular field, but theoretically one ought to provide a dominant structuring principle, though the interaction between several could also be considered. It is also to be expected that the structure and structuring principle of any given field will differ according to time and space. In his own treatment of the religious field, Bourdieu merely called religious capital the accumulated social capital of the priesthood, which is rather vague. Among other issues, such as his dependence on Marx and Weber's depictions of the ancient Near East, his specific analysis resonates more with the development of the Catholic Church in France than religions elsewhere. He also underestimates the role of non-priests in the religious field. One is therefore justified in seeking better ways to understand what religious capital might comprise, at least outside of France. Nonetheless, his idea of religious capital has been frequently received within religious studies as the form of cultural capital specific to a particular cult, and thus not restricted to the religious field, and this will prove useful below. In passing, we can note the definition of religious capital by a scholar I can't pronounce, Achaemenid, despite the fact his study was based on economic, rational choice theory rather than Bourdieu. He considered it to comprise familiarity with religion's doctrines, rituals, traditions, and members. This was slightly revised in a more sociological manner by Stark and Fink, who defined religious capital as the degree of mastery of and attachment to a particular religious culture. They find this comprises both culture and emotions, and posit that people try to preserve the religious capital. Other scholars have occasionally mooted other ideas for capitals belonging to the religious field, though I find none of them to be useful for the ancient Near East. Urban uses sacred capital without defining it. Baker has offered definitions of religious capital and spiritual capital that, due to a psychological framework, at least to me, appear to blend capitals with habitus. In the modern context of the United States, Werther has argued for defining spiritual capital as a subspecies of cultural capital, taking up embodied, objectified, and institutionalized forms. The individualist marketplace of religious ideas he is trying to analyze, however, is a very different world from the ancient Near East. In a forthcoming article, myself and some colleagues have offered two ideas for religious capital in Achaemenid Egypt, one as Newman and one as supernatural social capital. And it is the second one I wish to pick up here and elaborate, as useful for analyzing the Persian Empire as a religious field. By supernatural social capital, I mean a similar concept to social capital, but one that includes all purported relationships to culturally posited supernatural entities, so deities, demons, the dead, etc. This distinguishes the religious field from the cultural field by including all of these within it. It means that culturally posited supernatural entities are real insofar as they comprise part of an actor's perceptions and dispositions towards the religious field. Supernatural social capital comprises the relationships individuals are purported to hold with these, as well as their relative prestige. This means that the relative popularity and purported competences of these entities has a structuring role for the field. Those deemed more powerful will attract more interest in relationships, in other words, worship and sacrifice, than others. It also means those with recognized relationships to them will also increase in prestige. This is a positive feedback loop, much like how Gudma has analyzed the function of votive inscriptions. Bourdieu's concept of religious capital as the religious field's version of cultural capital, in other words, education in the appropriate rituals and lifeways, would be one of the prerequisites for humans to gain supernatural social capital. The exact exchange rates between the two would of course vary by cult and location. The benefit to this analysis is that it includes official and unofficial forms of religious roles and their attendant activity. Centralized cultic priests, popular magicians, exorcists, and family mourners all participated in networks of relations with various culturally posited supernatural entities in various capacities. One can equally analyze royally sponsored sacrifices and the spread of apotropaic amulets within this frame. I think this provides a useful way to deal with the undeniable fact that there were very many different deities, demons, and ancestors in the ancient Near East, many of which required very specific cultural traditions, or cultic traditions. Participation in any given particular cult required a certain amount of religious capital, which could be translated into supernatural social capital in proportion to any particular cult's rules. So, while the big brother of the Esagila had the most supernatural social capital with Marduk, he probably had little to none with Anu, I imagine. The king could maintain or gain some with either or both of these through gifts to the priests and to their temples. Further, since it is clear that ideas of exclusive worship are anachronistic for the Persian Empire, this invites analysis not only of the relative positions of various deities and their cultic sites, but the religious investments needed to gain social capital with any given deity or indeed ancestor. It also invites a dynamic analysis of the religious field when one recognizes a field as a competition between positions and structured by the changing positions of actors, human and supernatural. Incidentally, one could therefore read 2nd Isaiah's program as one to increase the supernatural social capital of Yahweh in order to encourage both relations with him and the requisite investment in religious capital needed to acquire the supernatural social capital. There we go. So, even if, as I would argue, the Persian great king was not a priest, he was part of the religious field as a person claiming relationships with various supernatural entities, not just Ahura Mazda or other formerly imperial deities, but also with Farna, likely with the royal Fravashis and or royal ancestors, to name a few. He also had structural effects on the shape of the field through several different avenues. One, through patronage of cults and priests, and their vetting, as I would argue. Two, through royal discourse on the divine and the world and worldviews. And three, through his own religious practice. A traditional role of kings in numerous times and places in the Near East was the patronage of and indeed building of temples, as well as of various kinds of religious functionaries, so priests, diviners, and prophets, etc. As with all patron relations, both the king and the client received benefits from these relationships. Royally patronized deities often became more widely recognized and worshipped, even being moved to the top of pantheons. Temples received social capital as well as economic capital from these relationships, as did religious functionaries. I've argued elsewhere that the great king insisted on vetting candidates for the priesthood along social criteria, meaning that he and his satraps had a strong influence on the social capital needed for attaining priestly positions, and thus their supernatural social capital. This is important for coloring debates over the impact of the king on the cults, as it is not their religious capital, in other words, their specific religious knowledge and competence, but their social capital that appears to have been the royal criterion in these matters, at least for those outside of Iran. This none the least determines some of the specific rules needed to reach higher positions in the field, thus shaping the effective strategies therein. While one may be justified in seeing the primary intention of royal propaganda to be to shape the political field, there are at least two mechanisms one could imagine for its effects on a religious field. The first is the fact that the dominant positions in the field are able to define what counts as capital and what counts as legitimate categories of evaluation and worth, what Bourdieu himself calls symbolic capital. The king, holding a relatively high position in the field, would thus have much power within the field. Further, the principle of homology between the political field and other fields suggests that similar rules and legitimation principles as in the former would shape the latter. Thus, as I have argued elsewhere, the royal inscriptions managed to redefine the value of deities based on their creative powers and their benevolence. This is because the king derives his legitimacy from the beneficial and creative powers of Ahura Mazda, which in a homologous turn in the religious field would increase the symbolic value of creation and benevolence within the scope of divine potentiality, or positionality, sorry. Finally, the great king had effect through his own religious habitus. The supernatural entities he chose to honor and worship, the rituals he sponsored and attended, the festivals and calendars he participated in would have increased in status. This is beyond the effects of any royal decrees in any such matters. Those wishing to maintain a high position in the religious field, especially outside of priesthoods, and those wishing to increase theirs would have had every incentive to adjust their own practices accordingly. Topics I can imagine where thinking in these terms include the worship of gods such as Mithra or Anahita, ancestor cults, and various festivals. One might also wonder about the implications for more restricted priestly practices. those priests whose positions were on an upward trajectory could both impose their understanding of proper priestly habitus on other priests, as well as having it copied by the same. I have in mind here questions such as ritual purity and lay roles in relation to cults, not to mention acceptable forms of divination, etc. For the sake of time, I'll only briefly suggest further ways one might investigate the larger structure of the religious field in the empire and some of the ways it was likely changing. The first is the issue of dispersion through the empire. In a previous essay, I noted that the Judeans and Iranians both share an experience of dispersal around the empire, though for different reasons. The Judeans lived around the empire as a result of various waves of deportations and presumably other forms of migration. Iranian colonists were also settled around the empire as military colonists, administrators, and satrapal elites. This means that these two groups at least potentially shared the experience associated with hysteresis, which is the term Bourdieu uses for religious habitus designed for one context and placed in another, incongruous context. It also means various cults were likely spread among groups of various different compositions and with different positions in the religious field, not to mention in the political field. One might think of garrisons versus satrapal contexts, for example, proximity to temples or shrines, or the likely very different habitus of administrative scribes, a position likely shared by some Judeans and some Iranians, and that of members of the imperial elite. So, for a very brief case study, move to Nehemiah 8, which we just talked about slightly before this. In his study of food in the Hebrew Bible, Nathan MacDonald has already pointed to the relevance of Persian feasting practices, which he sees as a good example of conspicuous consumption, a la Veblen. However, MacDonald also focuses mostly on the post-Persian use of the Persians as a Hellenistic foil for their ideal of moderation. It would also be remiss of me not to note that Layard has already wielded Bourdieu in her analysis of Ezra and Nehemiah, though she does not posit the religious field. So as it's visible below, her analysis, therefore, actually is significantly different from mine. Feasting has long attracted social scientific attention as a mechanism constructing and maintaining patterns of relationships. MacDonald has highlighted it as a potential mechanism for the development of what, in Bourdieusian terms, would be the political field. Following several anthropologists on feasting, he argues that feasting is a major way of converting economic capital into political capital, pointing in particular to the narratives associating Solomon's courts with feasts. He doesn't use those terms, though. I'm paraphrasing him in Bourdieusian terms. I would here like to analyze some hints in Nehemiah 8 as potential mechanisms for change in the religious field in Yehud as a subfield of an imperial religious field and a relationship with the broader political field. I first draw on Henkelman's work on royally sponsored feasts and then turn to Nehemiah 8. So Henkelman has argued that attestations of the ship feast in the Persepolis fortification tablets and in the Elamite version of XPH represent royally sponsored feasts or events for imperial workforces. He sees this as an instance of the royal ideology of gift-giving, but with religious and sacrificial meanings. Large amounts of foods were consumed, including duck, which he sees as specifically royal prerogative. And these events are attested involving very large groups of laborers, up to 520 individuals each. They appear to occur in November or December, and Henkelman induces culling of herds as the practical reason, and the king's presence in fires as the ideological reason. They were held in paradises and possibly at the sacred precinct of Pasargadae. The political symbolic function of such feasts is fairly transparent, as Henkelman has argued. The king, directly or through his agents, performs the role of the most generous gift giver, and in line with the rules of hospitality, demonstrates his superior social status. But the religious elements to this feast, however elusive in details, also have implications for a religious field. Although one might imagine such feasts, if held regularly, might popularize a particular holiday, it is worth considering more subtle but more important ramifications. In line with the principle of homology, the practice normalizes the patronage of the Persian king or his agents over religiously tinged public festivals outside of temple precincts. It simultaneously reinforces the position of the king in the field while maintaining a distinction between his position and priestly positions. As we know that the satraps mirrored the king and governors likely mirrored the satraps, this means there's likely to be a ripple effect in the religious habitus of the empire. In other words, a strategy for imperial officers at various levels to increase their religious capital would be to sponsor such large feasts for workers. This should not be taken to imply a uniform trickle-down of cults from the crown downward. Rather, a strategy available to imperial agents to improve their positions would have been choosing appropriate local festivities to sponsor in a conspicuous manner. Further, given the large-scale use of various forms of labor in the empire, this means one might expect a guest at such event to become incorporated into the habitus of the lower layers of society. This involves an implicit recognition of the patron's and ultimately the king's position in the religious field. There are also the practical considerations of which gods are to be honored, which priests chosen for their respective rites, which sacrifices are offered, which location they're held in, and the status distinctions which are marked between the guests, etc. Depending on the historical moment, such choices have the potential of reinforcing existing positions and rules of the game or to alter them. Bourdieu is as much a theorist of change as he is of stasis. Further, the precise table manners or etiquette of feasting are also implicated. This is most immediately illustratable through the spread of the Achaemenid-style bowls and rhytons, which represent manners of eating and drinking and were marked explicitly as imperial. One might justifiably relate such matters to hexis or embodied habitus, and for example, one might speak of the raising of hands in Nehemiah 8:6, which is reminiscent of the royal posture in front of the winged disc. The ship feasts of workers noted above were of course not the only or necessarily most prominent feasting practice of the king and the imperial elites. Nonetheless, they might provide a new angle for considering the material presently in Nehemiah 8. I do not wish to delve into the question of its origins or redactions, nor do I wish to go into the origins of Sukkot. Recently, Fried has argued that this chapter originally concerned a celebration marking the completion of the Jerusalem wall. Whether or not this is the case, the chapter has the governor and his elite give orders for one or two different communal feasts. There is a feast on the first day of the month, and then the festival of Sukkot, which one presumes also would have involved food, though this is not specifically stated directly. While here verse 12 might indicate it is not essentially organized distributional feast like the ship, both are essentially mandated. The feasts are meant to be fancy as well, with choice food and wine, albeit without much specificity. They are to be minimally distributed at least to those who are unprepared, and though people are to build Sukkot on their own roofs, there are also others in public spaces, suggesting a wider variety of groups envisioned, not just the traditional concern of pilgrims. One could also point to the more explicitly rarefied gubernatorial table in Nehemiah 5 for more explicitly distributional dynamics. I think the image sketched above of local elites emulating higher imperial elites and patronizing local practices provides an interesting angle to this passage. If we accept that Yehud and Samarina probably had agricultural festivals marking the harvest and or threshing of the harvest, we can argue that the workforces at the disposal of the higher level elites in the two provinces were probably well acquainted with these practices. There is no reason to assume that such regular agricultural practices would have been disrupted by the deportations by the Babylonians of elites. Rubinstein's argument that the building of temporary structures for the purposes of such harvesting has practical origin suggests that such agricultural workers would have been used to such practices and have continued them through the Babylonian and Persian empires, but that urbanites such as those in Nehemiah 8 would not have been. Through his authority as governor, Nehemiah is able to draw on the administrative resources of the temple establishment, the literate priests and scribes, here depicted as Ezra and the Levites, to increase his supernatural social capital. He does this by having the urbanites adopt as a sacred practice what had merely been a practical practice, thereby imbuing it as part of the cult and demonstrating his fealty to the local deity. In other words, what had been an incidental aspect of tradition, only relevant to a portion of the community, was taken up and transformed into a religious obligation for all. This is likely to be an effective way to co-opt workers into a new symbolic capital, by requiring minimal change to their habitus. As I've argued elsewhere, the issue of written Torah here is a red herring. What is really at stake is who is the legitimate authorities for religious practice. In this passage, it is those who control the ability to read and write, and thus in reality the administration of the province. It is perhaps worth noting that this is an effect on the religious field outside the temple proper, unlike in Ezra 3. It concerns the practice of the general laity. It also has a twofold effect on the rules of the game in the field. First, it implicitly adds a criterion of literacy to the religious capital needed to gain priestly supernatural capital. This presumably would favor those priests who worked in the imperial administration, seeing as these are the most likely to have had the need to learn literacy. Indeed, Ezra is depicted exactly as a dual priest and imperial agent in his book. In this, it is immaterial whether or not the practice decreed by the authorities was in fact written in a scroll or not. What matters is the ability to access a scroll and to explain it to others. Strictly speaking, literacy had not been necessary for religious capital to become a cultic priest. Now, however, it increased the priest's religious capital and thus potential for conversion of it into supernatural social capital. Second, it makes what one might have called a cultural practice into an explicitly religious practice. The building of booths becomes part of Torah, the way things are done, and thus part of the general religious capital available to all participants in the field. Of course, as capital available to all, it has little value for social distinction. In this, the priests would have had the incentive to emphasize their temple-centric aspects of this holiday. This analysis connects the religious field with both the economic field through agricultural practices and the utilization of labor forces, and with the political field through the agency of the governor. But the strategies for advancement in the field are autonomous from both. It also highlights how habitus and positionality can affect religious change. The administrative habitus acquired by the governor and his administrators shape their expectations for warrants within the religious field, while the different positions of urbanites from rural workers changes the meaning of a similar practice. I must contrast my analysis here with that relatively recently offered by Witters. So Witters has argued that Nehemiah 8 represents, in my terms, a deliberate conscious influence from Achaemenid imperial ritual to Yehud. While I agree that Iranian influence is an important issue for the Persian period religion, obviously, and even that Bourdieu offers useful tools for exploring it, this is not how I've analyzed this passage above. The first problem is I disagree with in his analysis of the relief program at Persepolis as depicting a liturgy in any meaningful sense of the word, so I do not think there's actually something to compare with Nehemiah. Second, his analysis depends on Nehemiah 8 depicting a specific historical event, which is also problematic. Rather than seeing Nehemiah 8 as an example of pro-Persian elites deliberately inscribing the empire into their ritual practice, my analysis above accepts such an imperial background in the form of elite habitus formation, but not in the construction of the feasts per se, whichever one thinks they are ultimately. At the end of his article, Witters helpfully points to a number of issues, what one might call symbolic capital. Certainly useful to think about, but the explicit use of Bourdieu highlights how the choice of local practices could still serve the specific interests of local elites, as well as being part of a wider imperial religious game. One not need to posit a specific ritual at Persepolis, or for any Yahudian elite to have ever visited Persepolis for the structural effects of Achaemenid feasting practices. Of course, this analysis cannot prove anything about Nehemiah 8's historic datings or origins. If Fried's new theory on the dating of the chapter is correct, then one would have to seriously consider the relation with the Ptolemaic Bacchic festivals, as she does. Yet the viability of the toolkit arguably remains, as the religious field within the Ptolemaic Empire was different and would therefore need to be reanalyzed on its own terms. Given a relevance for the Persian Empire, however, this enables a way to think about the potential social dynamics around religious change in Yehud that are not tied merely to redaction and exegesis, but to dynamic competition between positions in a religious field and the relations between this field and the political field. One might be inclined to automatically relate the supernatural social capital at stake in our case study to Yahweh, as biblical scholars are wont to do. Surely, since Sukkot is a practice in the Pentateuch, the only relevant culturally posited supernatural entity would be him. However, I think a distinction between religious capital and supernatural social capital is useful here, for taking into consideration the wider imperial religious context. Since we have hints in Third Isaiah of alternate practices, concrete proof of multiple deities in Elephantine, and a spread of popularity of apotropaic deities such as Bes, it is worth noting that supernatural social capital, like regular social capital, would not be exclusive. Its effectiveness would be just as situational as the former, based on prestige and on networks. Part of religious capital in the empire would be knowing the culturally posited supernatural entities most relevant in any given situation, as well as which practices were appropriate for them. The fertility and labor aspects I hinted at above, lurking behind the agricultural festival, could suggest a wider array of relevant cultic practices and entities around Sukkot, or whatever festivals are behind Nehemiah 8. Similarly, the chains of political patronage also suggest chains of divine patronage, or identification as potential dynamics within the field. This again invites a wider consideration of what Bourdieu would call symbolic capital, or the principles of legitimation and warrants in the field, requiring a zooming back out from just Yehud proper. Though one can analyze the material in this manner without using field theory, proper use of field theory requires it, and it thus is a useful heuristic for escaping canonical confines, if for nothing else. So that's it. That's it. Yeah.
Okay, any questions?
Yeah. First, thank you. I think it's very helpful to get some theoretical insights, particularly because many historians just somehow focus on sources and they evaluate them directly in a quite positivistic way, and therefore I think I'm very grateful for this theoretical input. I have a methodological questions. I do not know enough about Bourdieu in how far he makes claims that his approach is applicable also to cultures of the past. So when you develop something like this field theory with the elements of capital and habitus and so on, of course this is something that is extracted from certain experiences. And my impression was that maybe it was not a coincidence that your specific examples that you dealt with have to do with what comes closest to what in modernity is being perceived as an individual. So the king or the priest. So my question would be, what kind of dangers do you see in importing a theory that somehow is based on modern societies in order then to explain the way how ancient cultures might work, and particularly whether you see the danger of somehow importing elements from a more individualistic society into specific societal orders that might have been shaped by other governing principles than the interaction of individuals within a society.
Thanks. That's actually a really good question for Bourdieu. He has been used very badly, but if you, particularly if you read some of his interviews with people explaining what he's trying to do, he's very, very explicit that you should never take any of his writings as a model for any other time, that every single moment in time or society has to be analyzed separately. And he has these different concepts that are supposed to help you think about how that society may function, but it has to be based on the evidence you have for that society. He first started thinking along his terms actually in relation to French Algeria when he did his field work there, and the relationship between the ways pre-capitalist Algerians were dealing with capitalism brought by the French Empire. So he was already starting to think about earlier periods, and he he's very strong on insisting that sociology can't exist without history and history can't exist without sociology. So both sides hated him for a long time for this. What I see useful about this is, like, if you read any of his writing, he's written a couple times on religion, and my analysis is not like his at all. His analysis of religion is a bit weak, but I don't think he thought religion was very important because he's in modern France, and so they don't necessarily think religion is very important. So he didn't treat it very seriously, but his ideas are really useful, and to answer any of these questions, you have to sort of keep rethinking it based on your own evidence, and that's where I think it's useful. So everything is everything is recursive. So the sort of the habitus is defined by capital, but capital is defined by habitus, and field is defined by both. So to answer, do you think you see a field here? You have to keep going back and re-asking it again and again and again of yourself until you think it does or does not make sense.
But we are basically describing the elitist segments of ancient society.
Well, I was explicitly trying to include the bottom. The problem is the bottom is a bit we don't have the evidence for most of the time. But I imagine things like apotropaic rituals were quite popular with people who aren't writing otherwise. So we can still include them in this field. It's also why I would include things like ancestors, where everyone had ancestors, and so they still have access to them in the way they see that they have access to it, even though we don't often have writings about it. But that's an inherent problem for the Near East, right? We have writings which by definition are not from the bottom. So not much I can do about that.
Well, thank you so much. I was a little hesitant when I saw the subject of your paper, but because I have to admit that I find much of the academic use of Bourdieu's theories and language, especially, a bit repulsive. And
he's not easy to read. I'll give you that.
No, but what is worse is the people who use him. And who use his language without really understanding the logic behind it, I think. You know, I mean, this is just, actually it's not so much as a question as a remark, but the Nobel Prize winner of this year was the French author Annie Ernaux. Have you ever read anything about her? No? Okay, well, she was a great friend of Bourdieu. And I came to appreciate Bourdieu actually through her work, because she explained that what actually drives this man and what she recognizes from her own history is this is what drives his work, is how to reveal the mechanism of inequality and how people maintain their superior position towards others, colonial exploitations. I mean, there's a very real sense of indignation in his work that drives his work, I think. And that she could relate to, because she, for instance, she gave the example, she is from a small village in Brittany, and she made it into the educational system of France. And in order to get there, she had to gain social capital by passing through certain exams. And the way she describes those exams, it was not about knowledge, it was a ritual, and it was a ritual of inequality. So if I have a question, my question would be, if you apply Bourdieu, which it's an interesting thing to do, and you gave some good examples, I think, do you think it's helpful because it brings out more of the inner tension and inequalities that you have in ancient societies?
Well, that was our intention for starting it. So this is building on an extremely long project in Helsinki that we've had using Bourdieu for ancient Near East, and we are publishing a special issue using him with 3 case studies that will be out, some point. Yeah, the reason we started it was we didn't like either Weber or Marx's analysis of social structure in the Near East. Both of them are based on, outdated Near Eastern data. So you need something new. And they're also very static and very sort of hierarchical in a way that assumes that we know what the hierarchy is. And we wanted something that let us think through how one defines an elite, which is a term we hate because it's so vague, but how you actually define what these mean. And we found, because he is so insistent that you can't apply the rules of the game from any context to another context, you have to see how it works in that context, that it actually seemed the most useful for us as a way of thinking about it. But it's not easy, and you can't just take the terms and apply it, or just there are a couple studies where they sort of use habitus and just use it to replace whatever term tradition or something that they would have used before, and that's not at all what it's supposed to be. But he's very much concerned with hierarchy and social structure.
By the way, the rencontre assyriologique of this
yes,
coming year is in Leiden and on inequality in the ancient Near East.
I know, but I want to have holiday at some point.
When I listened to your talk, I was reminded of a talk that Diakonoff gave in the University of Chicago about slavery. And when I commented in the talk, I said you divided the talk into 2 parts. In the first part, you described Marxism very well and beautifully done. And the second part, you talked about slavery. Now, to get back to Elephantine, there's a wonderful Demotic document where the king says who is entitled to appoint the Lizonus priest, and such cannot be the Lizonus priest. And then you gave all the examples of the king defining who can appoint a particular priest in a particular cult. And I thought, now that's beautiful. Now what does that have to do with Bourdieu?
That was exactly what I was referring to as social capital. All of his criteria are social criteria. They have to be upper class. They have to have the right connections. They have to be well respected. None of these are cultic criteria. They're social criteria. So it's the great king, through his agents, insisting on having the right to choose who is able to become a priest on social criteria and not on religious criteria. But that then has an impact on the religious field. And they all are presumed to already have the cultic capacity. So this is choice between priests, right? So the choice is no longer then on religious basis, it's on social basis.
Hello. Hello. Yeah. First of all, I was interested in how in the beginning you mentioned how that the Persian kings were never the religious leaders. It occurred to me there's a good reason why, because you don't want your kingly position to be dependent on the vagrancies of agriculture and prosperity in your kingdom. It also occurred to me that and there are other people here that maybe could spread a light. I don't recall, except at Elephantine, where the head priests were actually named. I mean, Egypt, for example, had temples up and down the Nile, and the picture was of the pharaoh running the show. All the iconography was the pharaoh was making the offerings, but I don't recall of an inscription or a list of high priests that worked at that temple. And I know they also changed there were mishmerot. There were changes of the guard where a few months one group of people would be doing the priesthood and then another group of people. The point is that it's a very, I don't, you know, this is, I'm not sure how a Marxist or this is also the, excuse me, one thing, feasting. I mean, it seems to me that agricultural feasts were a natural product, and the king would allow it and would, in fact, would want it. I mean, the people were the ones in the field that were working. And so by having a feast, they're naturally rewarding the people for their hard work. I don't know if this is Marxism or Adam Smith.
Definitely not Adam Smith. But one, I would say the pharaoh is priest, unlike the Persian king, just like the Neo-Assyrian king was a priest, and apparently the Davidic kings, if we believe the picture.
The Persian king was a priest in Egypt.
That's different, though. I mean, that's not in his role as Persian king, in his role as pharaoh. Yeah, yeah. But that also means in Egypt things are going to, you know, the religious field will be different there. So that's a difference. So that's why you don't have high priests in Egypt, because they are just deputies of the king. But in terms of feasting, yes, I mean, this is the whole point. But the point is, one, nothing is natural. It's all human construction, and even our experience of eating is a human construction. So the ways in which this is actualized reinforces hierarchy. That's the point. So when you have a specific way in which the king sponsors a feast for specific people in a specific way, with specific foods, with specific times, this is reinforcing elements of culture that are arbitrary. Right? And this is therefore having a social effect. Whether it's intended or not is irrelevant. So for Bourdieu, his whole point with habitus is it's something you learn to do without realizing you're learning to do it. Right? And so if so one of the examples that we found really useful is for those of us who were born middle class, you learn how to go to museums, and you know that you're supposed to look at things and be appreciative and not supposed to yell and scream and run around. No one's ever told me this, but I know that's how you act in a museum. Right? It's just, yeah, exactly. I mean, but that's the thing. It's, yeah. But people like my colleagues who had working class backgrounds to talk about, they had to learn that when they went to university. They discovered that this is just, no one tells you, but you know it, and then you act accordingly. But no one's forcing you to act that way. You just realize it's in your own interest to act that way, and you choose. Right? That's why it's, yeah.
Any other questions? Okay, so thank you very much.
Yeah.